Hello, and welcome back to Civics Ain't Dead. It is not dead yet, anyway. And Butch and the Sundance Kid, we're here to talk another time about how history keeps echoing in the present, I guess. So tonight we're going to talk about something that's known as the military-industrial complex. You maybe hear this term every once in a while in the news, even today. I've certainly heard it invoked since we started our recent campaign, and I say we very lightly. The United States started its recent campaign against Iran. And people have kind of been hearkening back to this idea of a military-industrial complex. And so we thought we'd go back in history and try to figure out where that phrase comes from, but also talk more broadly about the relationship between our democracy, the United States, and the military. And so with that, I'm going to just jump in and start by telling a little bit of a story about Dwight Eisenhower, who was president in 1953 and gave what becomes known as a particularly famous speech. Sometimes they call it the Cross of Iron speech, which is a callback to William Jennings Bryan, former politician you don't need to know about tonight anyway. But it's also called the Chance for Peace speech. He gives this speech in April of 1953, shortly after Joseph Stalin, the brutal leader of the Soviet Union, has died. And the point of this speech is that maybe now that Stalin is dead, right, this kind of infamous totalitarian leader of the Soviet Union, maybe now is an opportunity, Ike suggests, for a de-escalation in the Cold War. And I just want to read part of the speech tonight because I think it will resonate with us even in 2026 in many ways. But I also think that many of us have heard snippets of this speech or possibly read snippets of this speech in a history class or a civics class somewhere in their past. And so I'm going to call that back by reading a few quotes here. So Ike tells his audience that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electrical power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. Okay? Now I just want to throw out some statistics for us in recent weeks, right? So a Tomahawk missile today, things are different than in Ike's day. A Tomahawk missile in 2026 costs $3.6 million a piece. We've now been lobbing these things at Iran for about a month straight. Current estimates for the cost of the war in Iran range from $25 to $30 billion in direct military spending for the United States. And I should note, we're recording this mid-April, just after the 2-week ceasefire has been put into place. And so that's where the numbers currently stand. And those are just some really rough estimates to try to wrap your mind around. So with that, Josh is actually our resident Ike guy. So Josh, tell us a little bit more about maybe how Ike's thinking on this continues to evolve or stay the same over his 2 terms of the presidency, and also kind of where we get this term military-industrial complex today.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll just put it out there for the record. Only one of us took a course solely on Eisenhower in college, and it wasn't me. So I mean, I did eventually have a job, or with the Eisenhower Memorial Commission, but I think we're both. I would like to think we're both pretty equal in terms of our knowledge of Eisenhower. So
I,
don't put that on me.
I still
Um,
like Ike. That's all I know.
hey, well, so do I. I mean, we did diss him a couple episodes ago for the Iranian coup in 1953, rightfully so. But yeah, he's pretty high up there in my book. Um, so yeah, your question. What was your question? I mean, there's a couple things I want to follow up on based on what you've laid out. I'll actually stay in the present with Iran. Um, yeah, I had been kind of filtering through different websites to try to find an estimate for the war, um, the Iran war so far. I found 28 billion in the first 39 days, from Mark Kansian, a retired Marine colonel and senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and that's cost of the forces, the use of the munitions, and also losses to bases and aircraft in the greater region. How are we paying for this? Well, we're adding to the national debt. We're not actually really paying for it now. We're passing it on to future generations. 11.3 billion confirmed spent by day 6, 16.5 billion confirmed spent by day 12 of the war, and we're now, I don't know, well into the second month of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's worth noting that the Pentagon today is the largest employer in the world. 2 million personnel. Up until 2023,
So
the
this is the
Pentagon,
DOD
the
or
DoD
DOW, I
officially,
guess.
I think it technically still is DoD. I don't really. That's not worth getting into. Until 2023, the Pentagon is also physically the largest office building in the world with 6.5 million square feet of space. There's a building in Western India for diamond trading that is completed in 2023, 2024 that overtakes it. But Pentagon is still the second largest office building in the world. The scale of what we're talking about in the 21st century when it comes to the American military is something that doesn't really need much explanation. We're all aware of it. It's we live and breathe the military. It's whether it's the military flyovers at NFL games, or the fact that we sing the Star Spangled Banner and pan to images of troops standing at professional sports as that is sung. It's just kind of like it's here, it's everywhere. We're all very aware of it. This is something Eisenhower was incredibly concerned about. Coming off the heels of World War II, where he served in uh, the U.S. Army most of his early life, and then ends up serving as Supreme Allied Commander of the
D-Day
Allied
invasion.
forces,
Yep.
and yeah, in World War II. So he better than pretty much anyone else in the middle of the 20th century, I would say, has a legitimate sense of authority to speak on this. He's seen the horrors of war firsthand. He's greenlit sending American troops to their death, Allied troops of many different countries to their death. He gets it. He doesn't take it lightly. And when he's reading the Cross of Iron speech in D.C. in 1953, that really is at the beginning of his presidency. But he stays relatively consistent with that belief, that a world that is continually increasing its armaments, and especially its nuclear armaments, is going to find itself on shaky ground. You can't really achieve a lasting peace through military might alone, I think, is what he would say. And his, the biggest goal he has, I would say, as president, is to achieve some sort of international order and global peace in the 50s. Again, coming off the heels of one of the most destructive wars in human history. But you see him trying to achieve this through a lot of soft power methods, whether it's like Sister Cities International, People to People, the Eisenhower Fellows. Um, he's always looking for ways to bring people together from different backgrounds and create a sense of mutual understanding, even between former enemies of war. Like the U.S. in the post-war moment really is exceptional in that it doesn't seek reparations from the countries that it had just
Germany and
defeated.
Japan. Yeah.
Quite distinct from what happened after World War One, right? So like Eisenhower is actually a huge proponent of building back up Germany and Japan and so forth.
Which fits into the mindset of the day, led by General Marshall, right? This idea of a Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe in a way to prevent communism from spreading, but also to kind of bring a new flourishing to these kind of war-torn parts of the globe after the war. And Eisenhower and Marshall, are kind of hand in glove in this vision of what they want.
Yeah, so I would say he's coming off the Cross of Iron speech. He's relatively consistent throughout the rest of his presidency. Now, the more famous speech, maybe a little less eloquent than that one, but the more famous speech is his farewell address, which he delivers televised to the country on January 17th, 1960. So I'll just read a portion of that and then we'll go from there. So again, and this is televised, you can find clips of it. It's an incredibly powerful speech, but he says, quote, "A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known by any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security more than the net income of all United States corporations. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved, so is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." So he's not the first person to coin this idea, but at least within a US context, this is really kind of the genesis of the phrase military industrial complex. And I mean, I looked up a few different definitions of it. Like, all of them were like a bit too formulaic for my liking. But the basic premise is that you have a public component with the federal government, with the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and then you have a private component with the usual suspects: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop, and a an army of private contractors, of defense contractors, who are profiting in private corporations off of government contracts to build military equipment, airplanes, fighter jets, you name it. And that Eisenhower is concerned by the early 1960s that things are already getting out of hand.
Huh.
And, well, I mean, just to, again, fast forward to 21st century, there's a reason why this speech and the Cross of Iron speech are so well regarded, because they're incredibly prescient, because it seems to come true, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. He's prophesying what plays out over the course of Vietnam, and then, of course, the kind of the closing out of the Cold War, and then when we enter the global war on terror. And now, we hear these lines now and they resonate with us in 2026.
Yeah. And just one more thing to finish out this segment. It's worth noting that Trump just asked for like $1.5 trillion for fiscal year 2027 for the defense budget. It's almost double what it typically is. I want to say it's around 800 billion annually, typically. But the government started auditing the Pentagon in 2018, and since then, the Pentagon has yet to pass an audit. They've failed 8 consecutive audits. One publication in December of 2023, on the heels of the sixth failed audit, calculated that the Pentagon can't account or couldn't account for 63% of its nearly 3.8 trillion in assets. So what that means is that the Department of Defense is buying supplies and weapons that it likely doesn't even need because they can't keep track of what they even have to begin with. And again, Doge, which clearly wanted to find waste, fraud, and abuse, they went in and found $80 million of money to cut from the Pentagon budget for diversity initiatives and academic research grants, but didn't look into any of the other stuff. So, I mean, the point being, quite bluntly, if there is waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, you don't need to look any further than the Pentagon. And that, to me, is pretty damning proof that what Ike was concerned about has really come to pass within the 75 years since he gave that speech. And I guess my question is, I've thought about the military industrial complex in a Cold War sense, but is that how we should consider it, like as like a middle to late 20th century phenomenon, post-war phenomenon into the war and terror, or are there earlier references to something like that in American history?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think Ike's right that he, by the end of his presidency, is commanding an arsenal that no other commander in chief could have even conceived of before that. We're talking about, nuclear and hydrogen bombs by that point, a vast professionalized military that even in World War II was not a thing, right? It's a mostly volunteer army um, and a drafted army in World War II, right? So, but by the Cold War, we're getting more professionalization. So I don't think Ike's wrong that it is unprecedented power in which the military has been endowed with by the 1950s. But there is, I think, Ike is pulling on a very old American civics thread when he condemns the idea of a vast military industrial complex, right? And this goes all the way back to the founding, right? So it is like a central tenet of American civics in the founding generation, and clearly all the way up through Ike, right? That there is this kind of common belief among Americans that standing armies, large military complexes, are potentially dangerous for all kinds of reasons, whether it's because of fraud, waste, and abuse reasons, whether it's because of collusion between private capital and public defense, or just in general, a standing army that could potentially threaten people's rights. That was an um, uh, initial spark that got the revolution going, the British occupation, military occupation of Boston, and the policing of their own subjects with British redcoats. And so Americans during the founding don't need to be reminded much that standing armies are a bad thing for democracies, right? Um, Samuel Adams is writing this in 1776, kind of the midst of the war, right? He's got the famous quote, "A standing army is always dangerous to the liberties of the people." And he's saying this even in the midst of kind of a life or death struggle against the British Empire at that point. Washington, when he has won the war and the Continental Army is standing down, Washington encourages Congress to disband the army right at the end of the war. And so in his circular letter to the states in 1783, he says, "A large standing army in time of peace hath never been considered has ever been considered dangerous to the liberties of a country." His protege, Alexander Hamilton, probably the most power hungry or at least central power hungry of the founding fathers. He agrees with this, even, right? In Federalist 8, he basically says the same thing Washington says. And then James Madison really puts a fine point on things for us in Federalist 47 when he says that the accumulation of all powers may justly be pronounced to be the very definition of tyranny. A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty, right? And so that combination there, right, in James Madison's ideas, it's a standing military force plus this bloated executive branch with too much power. That's a direct threat to liberty, right? Madison goes on in that same letter, right, to say that the means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home, which again is a prescient thing to hear in 2026. That all of this military spending and all of this ramping up of militarization, whether it's in the streets of Minneapolis or bases in the Middle East, they are two parts of the same whole, right? They are an executive effort to gain more power, whether that is through war fighting, as they love to phrase it, or um, just beefing up the military complex more generally. So I think these are like civics lessons 101 that Sam Adams, John Adams, George Washington, James Madison, all of them would subscribe to. And Ike still knows them in the 1950s, which speaks to kind of his education and his awareness of American history then. And this is something that basically all the founders agreed on, and they didn't agree on everything. So it's worth noting when they all sound the same, whether it's the Anti-Federalists or the Federalists, right? They all agree that standing armies are a danger to be aware of and something to be vigilant about. So they would agree with Ike for sure. And I think they would agree with the concerns now about the expansion of military operations in Iran without a lot of oversight or buy-in from the American people. So Ike knew it. Sam Adams knew it. I would like to think that you and I both know this. Why have we forgotten such a basic tenet of American civics? This kind of aversion to standing armies, this aversion to a militarized society, when it's kind of always been there in the American psyche since the Revolution. Now, why all of a sudden, maybe it's not all of a sudden, are we so desensitized to it and kind of just shrug and take it for granted today? What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any one answer. And I don't know the extent to which it's even true. I think people are aware and critical of it. And maybe it's a case of, well, what are we going to do exactly besides elect people who run on a platform of, you know, reducing the military budget? But that seems
Yeah, no
awfully
one's going to run
suicidal.
on that platform. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And so maybe the question is, well, why wouldn't they? And I think, again, I've alluded to kind of the baseline of nationalism that we all have in our country. We grew up in, at least in public schools, saying the Pledge of Allegiance. We hear the Star Spangled Banner every time we turn a sports event on. Um, I mean, I'm a historian of popular culture. I I'm a stone's throw from the Warner Bros. Studios here in Burbank. Um, I love Hollywood. I love movies, and most Americans, I think, love movies in some sense. I think there's always been, since the debut of Hollywood as an industry, there's always been a special and unique relationship between Hollywood and the U.S. military. One of the early instances is in the mid 1920s when William Wellman, this director, makes this film called Wings, when they use a bunch of World War One fighter pilots and World War One aircraft to film these, like, for the time, incredibly technically advanced dogfights in the air.
Yeah.
And Wings goes on to win the first Best Picture at the inaugural Academy Awards. Um, and a more well-known story is the Hollywood studios assisting with propaganda films in World War II. Uh, Disney's right there with making cartoons to kind of beef up enlistment numbers, and promoting people buying war bonds and stuff.
Well, and John Ford lands on the beaches of Normandy with a film crew, right? So, like, a
Yeah,
very famous Hollywood director goes over there and literally hits the beach, right?
yeah, yeah,
So Hollywood is there um, on D-Day.
yeah. Quite literally. I mean, that's a great point. And like a lot of times, people with studying popular culture, they say like, well, how much influence can a movie really have? And it's oftentimes the case historically that it's not even about like an interpretation of the movie. It's the physical material reality of like people working in Hollywood doing what you just said, uh, directly influencing the past in tangible ways. um, I would say after World War II, well, it's actually a bit more recent. By the late 20th century, there comes to be a more of a symbiotic relationship between the Pentagon itself and Hollywood. Each branch of the military has a Hollywood liaison office, which
I didn't know that. That's
kind of
interesting.
works. I mean, because when you're filming movies that depict war, from a production budget standpoint, if you're a Hollywood executive, it's a lot cheaper to call up someone at the Pentagon and say, "Hey, can you send over some fighter pilots and one of your jets?" Than it would be to go buy a fighter jet for however many $1 million. So, with the amount of like war films that are made, from the 70s, 80s onwards, there's a real demand for military equipment and military personnel and military locations as well, to film on. And so you see the development of this kind of symbiotic relationship. You know, Platoon, this classic Vietnam film, is one of these where there was a real cooperation between the filmmakers and uh, the DoD. The question is, what does each side get in this symbiotic relationship, right? So, as I mentioned, Hollywood gets access. They get access to military equipment, personnel, locations. Edwards Air Force Base here in California is always in films. West Point in New York, always in films. And a lot of
Annapolis, yeah, Naval
Annapolis for the
Academy.
Navy. Yeah, tons of like very prominent locations that we just kind of take for granted as like being in Hollywood films, but there's a reason they are. Um, all of it taken together, these the access to these things really amplifies the production value, I would say,
Hmm.
of films. When we think of Hollywood blockbusters, like the summer blockbusters, uh, you really need a lot of money pumped into them to give them that status.
Yeah,
And again, if you have fighter jets in your movie, that's gonna check that box. Like the Top Gun films, the original one in '86, and then
hmm
the more recent one.
hmm
Those films aren't blockbusters without access to those fighter jets.
yeah. I don't even think about that, but you're absolutely right. But what's the military get out of it?
Yeah, censorship in a way. They get control over the scripts. Oftentimes, they get control over how the military is depicted. I mean, basically, they can greenlight a screenplay,
Project,
or
sure.
they can't axe the project, but they can say, well, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're not going to get access to these things. And all of a sudden, $50 million production budget is going to look more like 75 million, and that might be enough to kill the project. I mean, those are just fake numbers I made up, but the financial incentive to get the Pentagon to buy in, to get access to the stuff, um, often makes or breaks a project. Um, in the long run, increased public support, I would argue, increased enlistment sometimes, I would argue. And also, you have to think about the chronology and the timing of when these films come out. A couple films that I grew up loving were the original Michael Bay Transformers film in 2007
Huh.
and Iron Man, the debut of the Marvel
I
Cinematic
remember that. Yep.
Universe in
Yep.
2008. So both of those films are riddled with military equipment and depictions of the U.S. military, and they're releasing kind of at the height of the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when public support for those wars is, I want to say, at like the all-time low by
Interesting. Okay.
2007, 2008.
Iron Man even has a scene. He's in Afghanistan, right? Like he gets
Yeah,
captured by terrorists or something at some point.
yeah. I mean, Iron Man, I think, is the quintessential movie to talk about here, uh, for a lot of different reasons. The first being when it comes out in 2008 and the timing of it. Um, yeah, I mean, the character of Iron Man, Tony Stark, this billionaire tech guy, kind of the fake. I'm not even gonna mention. Well, some people say he's like the fake Elon Musk, but no, like no. Um,
But isn't he a weapons manufacturer
yeah,
in the movie?
he is. I mean,
So he
he
is the
is
military-industrial complex
he
personified.
is exactly. And the movie starts with him going to Afghanistan to deliver a batch of new rockets to the U.S. military for use in Afghanistan. Yeah, and uh, he does get captured by the Ten Rings terrorist organization. Builds himself a suit to escape, and then realizes like he now has the beginning of his journey to becoming Iron Man, right? So in the filming of the movie, there's this guy Philip Strub. He's the entertainment liaison at the DoD. He works there in that position from 1989 to 2018, and he developed something of a reputation for like a guy that Hollywood was willing to work with because basically, as I've said, if Strub signs off on the film, the
Get
finances are going to be
access.
okay,
Yeah.
and you're going to get access. So there are a lot of anecdotes about Philip Strub and the director Jon Favreau being at odds with one another. A couple things Strub insisted change in the production of Iron Man. There was a push to make Tony Stark more of an aggressive arms dealer and a pro arms dealer at the start of the movie. Um, there's a scene that I guess was scrapped from the movie where the the henchman, the main henchman of this Ten Rings terrorist organization, he is kind of explaining this big arsenal of missiles he's got. And he looks over here and he says that that batch is from Bush, that batch over there is from Clinton, and the suggestion obviously is that like even the U.S. military, which we think of as the good guys, has supplied the bad guys with weapons,
Well, and it's
to
the old
garner profit. And
yeah, it's the old Mujahideen, connection where the Reagan's backing these guys that eventually become terrorists. Yeah, yeah, or at least their weapons fall into the hands of yeah. Okay, so they scrap that.
yeah,
Okay,
they scrap that. They scrap a scene where Iron Man is shot down by the Air Force. They didn't want that depicted. But overall, there's just like a downplaying of the overarching message about the ethics of arms dealing
hmm.
in the military, and it becomes more of a personal transformation of Tony Stark than it is about an indictment of the industry as a whole. Um, so what the production team for Iron Man gets is access to Edwards Air Force Base, use of an F-22 Raptor fighter jet, and other equipment. And the one last thing I'll say is there's one scene in particular that stands out. So he escapes from Afghanistan. He goes back to, I guess, Malibu, builds his new suit, his iconic suit, and then he flies back to Afghanistan to kind of exact revenge on the Taliban and the Ten Rings and the bad guys, basically. As he After he does that, he then leaves the airspace and gets intercepted by two F-22 Raptors from the Air Force. And there's an
Okay.
ensuing dogfight where he like dukes it out with these pilots and ultimately like destroys one of them and then rescues the guy who's parachuted out, and everyone's happy. But what's interesting is that as Marvel and Disney, or it's not Disney, sorry, as Marvel is filming uh, this movie, there's this ongoing fight in Congress between the Air Force and Congress to defund the F-22 Raptor program. Because at that point it had become kind of notorious as one of the most expensive fighter jet programs in American history. There's really no use for it. Iraq and Afghanistan don't really have air
There's no Air
forces,
Force. Yeah,
so it ends up being kind of useless in the war on terror. and it's just this huge cost sink. And technologically, there's all these problems with it. So, Congress ultimately caps the program at, I think, like 187 jets, but it's just insane that there's this, like, it feels like there's this direct Hollywood depiction of how cool these things are, and that's really all. Is like, look how cool these jets are. They're going at it with the
With
main
the
comic book guy.
superhero Iron Man, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and like, don't get me wrong, I love Iron Man. Like, I love, you know, I'm not dissing the movie, but to me, like, that feels like the clearest, most obvious sense of military propaganda I can think of.
And that, on the surface of it, doesn't even present as a war film, right? Like, in my mind, until you explain this, I don't think of Iron Man as a military movie, right? I mean, yeah, there's the arms deal, and yes, I remember the Afghanistan scene, but like, I would never put that in like the same category as like the Sands of Iwo Jima or Platoon, and yet this subtle messaging can slip in even in a fantasy, Marvel comic universe. Um, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was originally thinking of talking about the Transformers franchise because you get the same thing where you have these big robots fighting, but then for some reason there's just always like helicopters and missiles flying around too from the U.S. military. They just happen to be there, like tagging along. Um, but yeah, I mean, it is like, whether it's like the more traditional war films, like those, like, or Platoon or Pearl Harbor or whatever, or these bigger Hollywood blockbusters, I say the effect is the same in terms of propaganda. Um, and like, you see, there's one uh, kind of mythologized number out there on the internet. So after the first Top Gun comes out in 1986, which again is one of these classic films that you have a lot of military cooperation with. Um, it's like, well, I guess the accurate number is that the Navy sees an 8% increase in total enlistments the following year after that movie comes out. Now, some people say 500%. I think that's for like air combat specifically, but still, 8% overall increase in enlistment the
Yeah,
year following Top Gun.
yeah.
So it's not even like the soft kind of like propaganda work. It sometimes is direct
Recruiting work. Yeah.
recruiting. And again, like, does that answer your question of like, why do people buy into this? Like, no, but I don't think we can dismiss it. Like, it's clearly a palpable thing that's kind of with us, even if we don't see it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and with that, I mean, we should say, there is, I think people emotionally have a hard time separating these things, but there is a difference between supporting troops and veterans on one hand, right? And being rah rah for the military industrial complex on the other hand, right? Like, those two things are not the same thing, right? As the Trump administration has so nobly shown by defunding the VA at the same time that they asked for more military spending so they can launch Tomahawk missiles, right? So, like, I think both of us, we've got close friends, we've got relatives probably that are military, and so that's not to poo-poo anyone's active service, right? You know, the reason to enlist, there's lots of good reasons to enlist. There's lots of good reasons to view it as a patriotic thing, but um, the overall superstructure still needs to be talked about, right? And exposed in a way for what it is, which is this Eisenhower prophecy monster of a military industrial complex. Okay, so do you think that people are going to keep buying into this? This is the question I have specifically with the Iran war, right? Because as we can see from polling and just like general anecdotal evidence, I don't think this is a popular war, right? That Trump has launched against Iran, and it's unpopular for a couple different reasons. We've already highlighted some of those in previous episodes, but um, you know, we were we kind of preempted this war, right? We were not attacked. We went in there. Um, we assassinated a leader of a state. even though that state is problematic and he was a terrible person, right? That's still a thing that might make one uneasy in the world order. And like economically, this has not been good for us yet. Gas and oil prices keep kind of jockeying up and down. We've got the Strait of Hormuz stuff. And, a healthy number of Trump's base, I think, voted for Trump because they saw him as this quote unquote America First guy who promised to end forever wars in the Middle East. Now, I don't know what you call this one, but it's not over yet, even with the ceasefire. So I don't know. Do you think people are going to become more disgruntled with this kind of militarization, over militarization, um, loosey goosey use of the military? What do you think?
I mean, I think those are two different topics. Like, will people grow tired of the Iran war? Yes, I think people have been tired of the Iran war from the day it started.
Yeah.
Um, you're always going to have your subset of Fox News only viewers who could tell you it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But no, I don't think there's going to be overwhelming support ever for that war. But it's worth mentioning that military conflicts abroad are part of the process of replenishing armaments, right? Like all this money that the US supplied to Ukraine, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't like we were sending them cash. I
Right.
mean, well, some of it, but
Mm.
the majority of the funding was sending them old, kind of outdated arms that, we had in our stockpiles.
Sure. Yeah.
And what is the next step after those are used by Ukraine? Well, they need to build new ones. We need to replenish the stockpiles. So the fact that like the US military is involved in Ukraine, involved in Iran, whatever. I mean, that's part of just like the bread and butter of how the military industrial complex works. And again, like we're not saying we don't want
Sure.
any defense spending, but
Right.
like this to me is one of the basic starting points for like how do we fix the country? It's like
Yeah.
let's take a look at the defense budget. Can we introduce some transparency and accountability to it? Like, can we get the Pentagon to maybe get close to passing an audit so that even if we're going to spend trillions of dollars, we know where that money's going? Like, that's the baseline. And then once we have that accountability, do we really need more nukes? Like in an era of like AI based warfare and cybersecurity threats, like do we need to keep building nukes? I don't know.
Well, right. And we've entered a new phase of asymmetrical warfare, right? Where we shoot a $1.3 million missile at Iran, and they come back at us with a $60 drone. Yeah. Whatever.
Much cheaper drone. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like that's not great, right? That's like paying for a Spanish Armada and then letting it sink against these little English ships, right? So there's some basic like
are you saying
art
we
of
can
war
learn from the
things.
past? Yeah.
Not even just American history. Amazing.
I mean, to answer your question though, like will people keep supporting the military industrial complex? Like I have a hard time seeing an off ramp. It's not really an economic problem, I don't think. It's more of an ideological one. It's like it's part of our way of life as Americans. I mean, I guess my take on this is similar to my take on climate change, which is like why do people just ignore the data? Why do people just ignore the science? Like it's not really that hard to wrap your mind around. But it's not about the data, it's not about the science. And here I don't think it's about the numbers of dollars spent on missiles.
No, I would agree.
It's about this kind of collective psyche we've constructed as like Americans being like really, really, really effing strong. And the minute you get a politician saying, I'm gonna, chip away at that budget.
Yeah, no one wants that.
It's just like the red flags fly up and say, well, then we're not going to be really, really, really effing strong. So that's a problem.
Which is, again, it's funny because for the first, I don't know, 150 200 years, right? I mean, there was at least a healthy undertone of caution around that kind of stuff, right? Uh, Limited military complex goes hand in hand with limited government in a sense, right? And so there is this countercurrent that now seems to have mostly fallen away. But I don't know. I don't know. It's a question I don't know the answer to either, right? No, I don't think the Iran war is super popular. I don't think a lot of people, even within Trump's base, are really gung ho about it, or at least some of them aren't. And but I don't know that will lead to any kind of big picture rethinking of how the military, capitalist complex, if you want to call it that, or the military techno complex of the 21st century. I don't think that's not scaling back anytime soon.
No, and it's evolving with, as you say, the tech bros. I mean, the Palantir drones.
Yep.
It's
AI, cyber
it's
attacks, all that.
yeah, yeah. So no, I don't. I'm not optimistic on that front. But
Nope. Okay, well,
all
on
right,
that
well,
happy note, thanks for tuning in, everyone. This has been a fun one. It's nice digging into all these different parts of history. You never think you're going to have, Tony Stark and Sam Adams in the same episode, but we did tonight, so good job. And Ike thrown in for good measure. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks, as always, for listening to us as we kind of spitball these things along. But hopefully it's helpful one way or the other. Interesting or helpful or both.